During our last outing, I was locked out of all gears after a light dusting of the drag radials that we installed. Now that the car has made it to its resting place for the winter, it's time to put her on jack stands and find out what we broke. Up to this point, I have checked a few things to try and pinpoint the problem. If you put the trans into gear with the car off, and then try to start it, the car will lurch forward or backwards depending on the gear selection, so the shift forks were working. The slave rod can be depressed so the hydraulics are not preloaded. However, if you have the car in gear, depress the clutch pedal, and then try to start it, the car still lurches. For some reason, the clutch will not disengage. We start by disconnecting the battery. Next up is anything in the way on the passenger side, such as the catch can, air intake, and battery tray. Depending on your setup, you may have to remove some items that we just won't cover in this removal, but for the bulk of the work, this is one way to remove the transmission out of a 1G DSM. Don't forget to bag and tag all your bolts. The coolant overflow and intercooler pipes were next. Followed by the shifter cables, which were removed using needle nose pliers. The starter requires you to unhook the electrical connections from the rear and then the two bolts holding it through the bell housing. Before you go too far, drain the fluid. I inspected the drain plug, but I did not find any metal chunks or flakes. I then used a magnet to search for signs of destruction in the fluid, but I couldn't find any there either. Remove the cotter pin securing the 32mm axle nut and remove the nut. This is where anti-seize really pays off. My axles were free, but if this is your first time doing this, expect at least a little fight. The shock has to be removed to give enough wiggle room to free the axle. Once the axle is free, secure the knuckle to the shock using a zip tie or some string. Now that you have a better view of the tie rod, remove that cotter pin and loosen the castle nut, but leave it on to protect the threads. Now, utilizing a metallic hammer to hit the knuckle where it surrounds the tie rod, you can separate the tie rod from the knuckle. This may be another area that puts up a fight, but avoid hitting the threads at all costs. Use a pry bar and a hammer to pop the axle loose from the tranny. Your downpipe is held in by a few bolts and an exhaust hanger. Remove the 5 T-case bolts and wiggle the transfer case off of the input shaft. The slave cylinder is held in place using 2 bolts. We will place a bag over the slave cylinder to keep the hydraulics from pushing the slave rod all the way out. Remove the crossmember, and don't forget your inspection plate. This intermediate shaft is held in by 2 bolts. Once removed, the whole axle assembly will slide right out. The transmission mount is held on using 6 bolts. 4 through the frame and 2 through the mount to the transmission. You'll want to remove the line going to the slave cylinder. Now it's time to support the tranny. I chose to use a tow strap wrapped around the trans to support it. One leg of the strap goes on either side of the front diff. This will provide stability and not allow the trans to slip out of the strap once it's loose. And once you have the weight supported, remove the last 2 bell housing bolts. Now you just need to wiggle the trans loose and lower it down. When I was thinking about what I broke, One thought was that the input shaft splines had become one with the clutch disc, so I didn't expect the trans to come loose, but it did. Remove the pressure plate bolts using a star pattern in 3 equal steps. Hey look, my clutch disc is levitating all by itself. Wait a minute, that's not supposed to be like that. Well, we found the problem, now we just need to remove the clutch disc. That one felt good, and let's try that again. That escalated quickly. So what's the damage? The flywheel definitely got pretty hot, and chunks of the clutch disc can be seen embedded on the flywheel surface. The clutch disc shows signs of excessive heat, and the respective chunks that are embedded in the flywheel can be found missing out of the clutch disc. This is no fault of the parts or the installation. No, this seems to be operator error. If you look at this log where I got locked out of all the gears, you can see that I never let all the way off the clutch pedal. The item labeled clutch switch should go to 1 when the clutch pedal is all the way released. In this case, it did not, leaving me to believe that I kept slight pressure on the pedal, allowing the clutch to slip for an excessive amount of time. This effectively welded the disc to the flywheel, not allowing the clutch to release. This means that the trans should be in good health, and the only real problem is the clutch disc, and possibly the flywheel if it can't be turned down to remove the problems. Happy boosting!